In this video, I'm going to walk you through the process that I use for soldering frames together for wire-wrapped pendants. I've cut 6 inches of 16 gauge square for the frame of this project. One of my favorite parts about using this method of framing over my traditional method of wire-wrapped frames is that I can delve into my scrap pile for useful pieces, like this 14 gauge half round. This is about 2 inches long and a little bit too short for most of my traditional methods of framing, but perfect for putting together the frame I'm working on today. The first step, I'm going to take my 16 gauge square and I'm going to create the setting that my main stone will sit in. Taking my half round and square pliers, I'm just going to bend it around the top of the plier where the back of the stone will sit on. Now, because I need a little bit of space between the stone and the setting for this method to work, I'm not particularly concerned about making sure that it's exact to measurement like I would be if I was fabricating a more traditional setting. My next step is going to be to go ahead and complete the framework, making a full loop that the stone is going to sit in. I've brought it up on top of my other square, so it creates an oval that my stone sits snugly into. I'm going to take my flush cutters and make sure that the flat ends are cut together, and before connecting it I can file away just a tad from both ends to make sure that I have a nice flush meeting of the wires before soldering, so I have a strong connection. Once I've filed my endings, it should look something like this, with both wire endings sitting nice and flush next to each other, ready to be soldered together. I like to use the sheet solder. When soldering, you want to work with your hardest solder first, and only work down to medium or easy when you need to. I'm going to go ahead and cut a small chip of solder off of my hard solder sheet here. It doesn't take much. You only need a little bit in order to connect a nice firm joint and reduce the amount of cleanup that you'll need to do after soldering. This is the workstation that I'll be doing my soldering on. I have a heat-resistant solder board with a piece of the honeycomb soldering block on top of it so that I have a safe surface to work on. I have my solder pick over here on the left, my tweezers on the right, and a cup of water to quench in. For flux, I'm using this Firescoff ceramics flux coating. I've placed my solder chip here down in the bottom right. I'm ready to go ahead and apply just a touch of heat to our frame. Add my flux. Then I can heat the tip of my pick, and it'll be able to pick up and ball the solder. And then once I bring my piece back to an appropriate temperature, I can drop it on the seam that we want to solder together. Evenly bring both sides of the wire to temperature so that it'll cause the solder to run through the seam. Once the solder has run, I can take it in my tweezers and extinguish in my water. I do have a touch of extra solder remaining that I want to go ahead and file off of the piece and burnish. From here, I can go ahead and drop this element of the frame into my pickle pot to clear off any remaining oxides or flux from the piece. Now that my frame is clean, I can go ahead and take that remaining square that I have left over from the 6 inches that I cut, and I'm going to solder it to the bottom of where I am connecting the frame. Alright, from here I have a fair amount of workable framing material soldered together at the bottom of my frame so I can begin to create the outline of the piece. I'm going to take that bit of framing at the bottom, bend it around to begin to create the more teardrop shape that I'm looking for in this piece. I've went ahead and formed that square all the way back around to the top where it'll sit flush next to our setting. With this joint ready to solder and this next wire ready to be added to the piece, I'm going to show you another technique that I use for connecting multiple solder joins without having to pickle and restart each time in between. Taking my hard solder again, I'm going to go ahead and cut 2 small pallions, approximately the same size. I've set everything up to be ready to go ahead and solder. I'm going to go ahead and apply my flux to the area that I will be soldering onto. I'm going to bring it to heat so that my solder will bubble up, and then once it has finished bubbling, I'm going to place both solder pallions onto the seams that I want to solder first before adding heat to the piece. Let's go ahead and start off by heating our flux until it has bubbled away. Next, I can take my tweezers, place my solder directly onto the joints that I want to connect. And I can bring the piece to temperature and let the solder run through our seam. Once I've quenched, you can see my two seams are connected back to the setting of the piece and ready for cleanup, pickle, and continue to work. Once I've pickled my frame clean again, I can make the final bend, connecting this wire back to the bottom of the frame. Gives me a good structured outline for the piece that I can then begin to build off of. I'm going to go ahead and solder this last join together. Now that I have the outline of the whole frame soldered together, I'm going to go ahead and file this ending down so it blends smoothly into the frame, and I'll show you some options for accenting your frame. One of the greatest advantages of using this method of framing for your pieces is that you can easily solder in settings for additional stones and accents throughout the piece. To see what this piece looks like finished, follow the link below to Andrew and I's Instagram pages. This video wouldn't be possible without the support of my patrons. A huge thank you goes out to them for their continued support for the channel. If you're interested in helping support the channel, check out the link to my Patreon below.